G'day legends, and welcome to the first ever episode of Leaguie Cast, where you're going to get a massive range of content over the course of this upcoming season, from long form stuff like this to more short form reactions to news and stuff that isn't quite big enough to make it onto the main channel, but I feel I've got something to say about it, a point to make, and this is the exact kind of place where I will do it. But today, the first episode will be the season preview for 2025. I'm going to go through every team, looking at their best 17s for the upcoming season, the 17s I think they will actually go with as well, little changes there, and the upsides and downsides, the things that are changing for them this year, why I think they might go better, why I think they might go worse. If you're watching this before having seen my ladder prediction video on the main channel, I'd recommend watching that first. It gives you a bit more of an overview, but this is more of the deep dive stuff. As I mentioned over on the main channel, this is something that's intended to be a little bit more laid back, a little more unfiltered, and some easy listening for you, soon to be available on Spotify and Apple Music as well, or essentially wherever you get your podcasts. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it, and starting with the West Tigers. Looking at the players that they've signed first for this year, you've got Jarome Luai from the Penrith Panthers, as well as Sunia Turuva. Jarrell Skelton comes in from the Bulldogs, Royce Hunt from the Sharks, Jack Bird from the Dragons, and Terrell May from the Roosters. And in preparation for this, I've gone and highlighted key signings for each team, but with the Tigers, they're one of very few examples where literally every single signing has been marked as key, because all of these guys are going to play a big role for the Tigers this year. And I will just start with Jarome Luai. Those of you who've watched my channel for a long time will know how big a fan of Luai I am. I think he receives a significant amount of hate, not just because of the personality that he has, but over his footballing ability in itself. There's a lot of people that say he's been carried throughout his career by the likes of Isaiah Yeo and Nathan Cleary, even recently Dylan Edwards. And I do think this is a really good sign that he's backing himself to sign for the worst team in the league, taking on that challenge of being the main man, moving out of the 6 jersey into the 7 jersey, being a leader, and taking on that responsibility of guiding this team back to the finals after such a long time spent in that wilderness. I think it's very convenient to essentially sort of forget that Nathan Cleary was out for a significant period of last season, and he's spent decent chunks of his career out injured. Luai has had to cope without him and has consistently lived up to that challenge, particularly last year where he was the halfback. This is a guy who's won Origins. He's obviously won the last 4 premierships in a row. He's essentially never known anything in his career other than winning. So it will be a tough personal challenge for him to come into an environment that isn't as good as Penrith, but I really back him to be massively influential on that environment around him. And having Benji Marshall as his coach, Jesus, like having Benji 2.0 running around again for the Tigers. And moving on to his teammate, Sunia Turuva, also coming in from the Panthers, obviously, he comes into this Tigers side as their number 1 outside back option, right? He's the best one I think they have at the club, but he's still a very, very young player. So he's going to be able to impart a lot of experience and positive culture on these young Tigers outside backs like Leaguie, for example, but he's still young enough to be able to relate to them and fit into this young Tigers playing group. And that, to me, is really exciting for the West Tigers. Moving on as well, Jarrell Skelton. He's actually a little bit of an older player than a lot of people realize, but coming over from the Bulldogs, he's not overly experienced, but what we saw from him last year when he played NRL, he is an absolute dynamo. He is such a big boy, coming in on the wing, making big hits. There's one I recall him making in a game at the Central Coast against the Roosters where he absolutely wiped out one of the Chooks players. So him coming into the Tigers, there's a lot of people with a lot of high expectations of him. I think Charlie Staines, who was on the wing for the Tigers last year, had a decent year last season, but everyone is thinking Skelton will make the 17 ahead of him, and I find it very hard to argue with that. Royce Hunt from the Sharks, obviously signed a while ago, but he's in an interesting stage in his career. He was obviously a little bit of a role player at the Sharks, and I don't mean that in any sort of derogatory way. The role he played was very important. His impact off the bench was unreal. But now coming into a Tigers pack that we'll touch on later has lost David Klemmer as well, his responsibilities do go up a bit. He will have to shoulder a little bit more of that load and lead from the front. And he'll be working very much in tandem, I believe, with Terrell May coming in from the Roosters, who I think second to Luai is the one I am the most excited about. He never really got many minutes in his Roosters career. He was more used to stints between 30 and 50 minutes, but his form was almost Origin caliber last season. And if he can back that up again for the Tigers this year, he could be one of the best forwards in the comp come the end of the year. He somehow manages to be absolutely huge, massively physical, but also have a really good motor on him, incredible fitness, and great ball playing. So I think he's a tremendous loss for the Roosters, but what is the Roosters' loss is the Tigers' gain, and he has the potential to really set the tone for this franchise as they move into a new era. And then lastly, you've got Jack Bird, who is just a very versatile squad player. You know, he's bounced around a few clubs over the course of his career, but he does a job whether you play him at centre, 5'8", lock, even back rower he's played a bit of at the Dragons. And last year in reserve grade for them, he had a couple of appearances at fullback. So he's a guy who's a real Mr. Fix-It. And in the current era where we see HIAs and all that increasing during games, it's very, very important to have someone like Jack Bird that can come off the bench and just slot in anywhere and cover at a 6, 7 out of 10 level. In terms of looking at their losses, their total list is Isaiah Papali'i to the Panthers, Junior Tupou to the Dolphins, Stefano Utoikamanu to the Storm, John Bateman to the Cowboys, Jaden Sullivan to South Sydney, Aiden Caesar off to the Super League, and David Klemmer off to the Dragons. And as I said in the main channel ladder predictions video, all of these guys, while there's some big names in there, none of them were particularly working out at the Tigers anyway. When we look at these sides that struggle over a long period of time, often we'll see guys who are being potentially overpaid and it's just not functioning for them at the club. They are not finding form. The Tigers, in one fell swoop, in one offseason, have managed to offload all of those guys. I think it's an absolute recruiting masterclass from them. It essentially means that none of those guys are particularly big losses. I'd say with the exception of maybe Stefano Utoikamanu, right, who over the course of his career at the Tigers has been a bit up and down, but played well enough to play Origin and represent Samoa. But recruiting Terrell May to come in and replace him is pretty much as good as a replacement as you could want. So I think a very, very positive recruitment drive for the Tigers, and that is what I've put as their biggest upside for this year. They've got the best recruitment drive in the league, which is incredibly impressive for a side that has won 3 wooden spoons in a row. There just aren't really holes in this side anymore. And I'll get into that 17 now, seeing as we're on the topic. This is, I guess, a bit of a combination of what we've been told that these sides are going to be going with, but sort of with a bit of leaguey flavor in there as well. How I would go about combining the sort of rumors that we've heard so far. So for the Tigers, at fullback, I've got obviously Jareem Buller, young Fijian fullback coming into his 3rd season of first grade. I'm tipping a very big year from him. On the wings, I've got Sinia Taruva and Jarrell Skelton, the 2 new recruits. In the centres, this is a very interesting spot for the Tigers, subject to a lot of debate. I originally went with Justin Olam and Adam Dewey, or Duehi as it is pronounced. And I'd stick with Adam Duehi. I think his form in the trials was very good, but reports did come out yesterday, very unfortunately, about Justin Olam. He's heavily rumoured to be medically retiring, which is such a shame. I mean, he's a national hero. A lot of my viewers are from Papua New Guinea. He's a national hero over there, and he's only 31. You know, I thought he could have at least a couple of good years still ahead of him, but does look like the end of his Tigers career. So I would instead, in that other centre position, go with Stafford Toa, a player who I'm a very big fan of. He hasn't ever really kicked on in his career, but I do think if a coach just backs him, says, here's your spot, you're playing centre now, nail that down, he could thrive there because he's been moved around fullback in the wing a lot as well. So I'd go with him there. The halves name themselves, Lachlan Galvin and Jerome Luai, enough said. Front row, Terrell May absolutely starts. I think him setting the tone early is very important. In terms of the other front row spot, you've got a few options, but I think I'd go with Alex Twal. He's really good at just absorbing that early pressure, tackles at an incredibly high rate. And I think he'd just have to go there and be solid and allow Terrell May to be the more expressive of the two front rowers. Hooker, obviously, Captain Api Coruscant picks himself, probably the first name on that team sheet. Back rowers, one of my favorite players to watch in the league, Samuela Fainu, is in one of the back row spots. Him this season, I think, is going to be very, very exciting because last year, his form was unreal. He was, I think, quite possibly second to Lachlan Galvin, the best player that the Tigers had last year. His form for a young guy was brilliant. And with another preseason under his belt, I watch him and I see a young Hamole Olakau'atu, honestly. So I'm very, very excited to see him. And the other spot would go to Alex Seyfarth, who was named captain in one of their trial games, so obviously regarded pretty highly over there at the Tigers. Can be a bit hot-headed, but we'll see as he matures throughout the rest of his career whether he can really nail down that spot and prove a quality option for the Tigers. And then at lock, a lot of people have gone with Jack Bird, and as much as I love ball-playing lock options, it doesn't seem like that's the way they're going to go. Benji likes three sort of front rowers. So Fanua Bole is a little bit more of a smaller guy compared to the likes of Twal or May, and has a bit more ball playing in him, but still has that punch. So I think he's a good position to start there. Interchange bench, number 14, I've got Latu Fainu, who is obviously a little bit versatile. He can play either position in the halves, but we saw him really bulk up at the back end of last season. So if you had to put him, say, at lock for a brief period of time, or even at hooker, I think he'd do a solid job. And I mean, it's between him and Talon De Silva, but he does offer that bit more versatility, I think, that De Silva doesn't. Other positions on the bench, obviously I will go with the new signing, Jack Bird, as well as Royce Hunt. And that number 17 jersey, a little bit more up for grabs. There's a few options there, but I did land on Sione Fainu. So the third Fainu brother to line up for the Tigers in 2025. My only concerns really with this team, I mean, obviously it does have to be said, there's quite a losing culture there. But they've brought in players that should be capable of turning that around. The other concern is the coach himself. Now, I think Benji did a very good job last season. You know, a lot of people just look at the fact that the Tigers finished last again and so dismiss the whole year, which I think is super unfair. The Tigers won a quarter of their games last season, which is a stat that I often cite when people say that the competition isn't even. Our side that finished last won a quarter of its games. That to me is insane. So for Benji to have done that with a very, very young team, blooding guys like Galvin, De Silva, the Fainu brothers, I think that was really good. It might not have been obvious, but they had an upwards trajectory after last season. Bringing in all the guys that they have now, it should only really continue, but the pressure is now there. Benji, I mean, for all the goodwill that he has at the club, the Tigers showed on a couple of occasions throughout his player career that they are willing to move Benji Marshall on if it suits their interests. And they do have the side to do it now. And if they think that the coach is the weak link in that roster that they've got, then they'll probably be inclined to move him on and try and sign somebody else. So he is under pressure, but I back him to do pretty well and get the Tigers not quite into the finals this year, but in the race for a fair amount of that time. Next up, we've got the South Sydney Rabbitohs, obviously finished in second last position last year, but a decent little recruitment drive. They've got the likes of Lewis Dodd over from St Helens, Jamie Humphreys from the Manly Sea Eagles, Ewan Aitken from the Dolphins, Lachlan Hubner also from the Dolphins, Jaden Sullivan from the Tigers, and Josh Schuster from Manly. So a couple of good options there. Ewan Aitken is one I particularly want to draw attention to because he's a guy who I think has coasted really under the radar in recent seasons, essentially since signing for the Dolphins. His stats are very, very impressive, having made the shift from center to back row, and it should be quite a big sign to people that Wayne Bennett decided to recruit him to follow over from the Dolphins, was insistent on bringing him over and having him play in the back row. There are some pretty solid back row options already for South Sydney. You've got the likes of Keon Kamatangi, Tallis Duncan, Jai Arrow could play in the back row. But Aitken, I think, will really add a bit of quality there, particularly with Cameron Murray injured. We will touch on that later, but To me, that will move one of Koloamatangi or Duncan into the middle, and that allows Aitken to take up a spot on the edge there. Then you've got Lewis Dodd and Jamie Humphries, which is a really interesting one to me. Now, it is a bit of a downside for South Sydney this season that their halfback jersey doesn't seem to be completely worked out, but it's fascinating because throughout this entire preseason, I've been so high on Lewis Dodd. I've been talking him up. I think the Australian media have been so unfair on him, reporting in quite some depth his dropping from St. Helens last season, but absolutely zero media coverage for him working his way back into that side and only not making the preliminary final with St. Helens after a golden point loss to Sam Burgess' Warrington Wolves. He's achieved a lot in a very short career so far, so I was very confident that Lewis Dodd was going to be the guy for South Sydney, but watching the trial form, particularly that Charity Shield match against the Dragons, Dodd kind of struggled. The game kind of just went by him, and when he actually got sin binned and Jamie Humphries came on in his place, Humphries was exceptional. Not only does he look physically just in great nick, but he was so confident on the ball, so much more dynamic, seemed to offer so much more in attack than Dodd did. So what to me was a pretty done deal in terms of Dodd being the 7, I think he's blown completely open right now, and it really wouldn't surprise me if Humphries is the 7 to start round 1, which I'll touch on in my predicted side. Just quickly though, their losses, they've got Tane Milne departing to the Huddersfield Giants, as well as Tom Burgess, Damien Cook departing to the Dragons, as well as Lachlan Ilias, Dean Hawkins to the Eels, Michael Cheekham to the Seagulls. They're also losing Leon Howe and Isaac Tuitupo Thompson. Now for their best 17, I have not put Cameron Murray in this side because although there is still a little bit of uncertainty around his injury, he does look to essentially be ruled out for the entire year. But I have gone with Latrell Mitchell at fullback just because although he will be injured, he is definitely their best option in that position. And I think especially under Wayne Bennett, that's where we've seen him play his best footy at fullback. So that's where I've gone for Mitchell. On the wings, Alex Johnston and Tyrone Munro. In the centres, Jack Whiten and Campbell Graham. They do pick themselves. The halves, though, Cody Walker at 6. Again, I mean, he's definitely getting on in his career, and last season wasn't the best form we've seen from him, but definitely their best option at 6. And I do have to go with Humphries at 7. As I mentioned, I had Dodd there for a very, very long time, but I think it does have to be Jamie Humphries. Front rowers, I've gone with Origin representative Jai Arrow and Tavita Totola, who's returning from injury. Tongan international. Spent a massive amount of last year out injured, so he's a big return for South Sydney. Hooker, they've got Peter Mamouzelos, who has a lot to prove this year, I've got to say. I mean, he's been sort of on the verge of breaking into this Rabbitohs side for a very, very long time. They've shown a great deal of faith in him by letting Damien Cook go and not targeting any other hookers, although rumour has it Jamie Humphries was originally signed as one. But Mamouzelos does seem to be the guy. We'll see how long he's given in first grade to prove his credentials, but while he's shown a decent standard of play so far, it hasn't been particularly eye-catching. So big things to prove this year for Peter Mamouzelos. In the back row, I've gone with Ewan Aitken on one side. The other spot could be either Tallis Duncan or Kalen Koloamatangi, with the other one playing lock. And I am very torn between the two. We saw awesome form from Kalen Koloamatangi last year when he had to fill in for Cameron Murray at lock. And it almost makes me think that that was his best position. So I am inclined to start with Koloamatangi at lock, but Duncan is a little bit more of a smaller body. He's a bit more of a ball player than Koloamatangi is, so might be in some ways a bit better suited to that lock position. I'm happy to go with either. On the bench, number 14, Saliva Havili. Then you've got David Mawali, Sean Kepi, and Jacob Host filling in the rest of that squad. So not the strongest bench, but first graders who are very much established and will do a job for South Sydney. Now, this was a side I was very high on until the injuries to Cameron Murray and Latrell Mitchell, and that's because they have undoubted quality. Wayne's obviously coming back in as head coach, and he is the guy who knows how to get the best out of the likes of Latrell Mitchell and Cody Walker. That's when they've played the best footy of their careers, under him. I'm still not completely sure what's gone wrong at South Sydney over the last year and a half, but if it's a question of standards, Wayne is not going to allow low standards to shine through at the club at all. So he'll be an easy fix to that problem. But, you know, even a guy like Wayne can't coach around a horror injury run. Heffron Park does seem to be very cursed, and we'll see whether that does continue throughout this season. But if it does, it's going to be a very, very tough road ahead for South Sydney. You know, we spoke about the whole halfback situation. Either way, whether they go with Dodd or Humphreys, neither are experienced NRL halfbacks. Dodd has never made an appearance at all. Humphreys, I think, has made one in his career. So it's definitely a lack of experience. And while you've got Cody Walker there, he's not the orchestrating type. So it could at least take a decent chunk at the start of the season for them to sort of find the ropes and find the combinations between the two of them, as well as just lastly the fact that they, in my opinion, have the toughest draw in this year's premiership. So odds are stacked against them, but we'll see what the Rabbitohs can provide. For Parramatta now, a side who I think have had a very, very good recruitment drive. They've brought in the likes of Zach Lomax, Isaiah Iongi, Dean Hawkins, Jack Williams, Josh Adokar, Josh Papali'i, Jordan Samrani, and Ronald Volkman. Now, I'll touch on a few of those guys there. Firstly, Zach Lomax. I mean, we saw his form last season for both the Dragons and the Blues. He was absolutely unreal. And while there's a lot of people who've been saying that moving him back to center is just a stupid idea because on the wing he was so much better, I think that kind of doesn't really acknowledge the way in which he was playing winger last season. You know, when we picture Zach Lomax last year, it was all these high contested catches, most of which he would actually run infield for. So him playing center wouldn't necessarily prevent him from being able to do that. And if anything, jumping over opposition centers may be even easier than jumping over opposition wingers. So while you are losing the kick returns that he provides, you're not, I mean, he'll be taking the second or third hit-ups in those sets, so it's not the end of the world. Same with Josh Adokar, who they've recruited from the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs. Is he the same Josh Adokar as we once knew? No, but he's still a very, very high-quality player. He knows what it takes to win in the NRL, and is a better wing option than the Parramatta Eels have had for quite some time. He'll replace Micah Sevo, very different styles of winger, but I think he's going to bring a lot of quality to the Parramatta side, and they've lacked high-quality outside backs, but with Lomax and Adokar, they are there now. Another one, Isaiah Iongi, who's going to be their fullback, I believe, for this year. It was between him and Josh Papali, but to me, it's Iongi coming over from the Penrith Panthers. He looked very impressive in the preseason trials, in my opinion. And while it might take some time for him to adjust to the rigors of first grade week in, week out, I'm not ruling out the fact that he could have a very impressive season, and I think he's my early prediction for Rookie of the Year. And then lastly, Jack Williams, who very interestingly, after signing from the Sharks, was promoted into the Eels leadership group for this year. The Eels are losing Regan Campbell-Gillard. We'll touch on that a bit later, and I think Jack Williams is going to fill that spot in the front row. Different style to Big Reg, but he's got a bit more of a motor on him, does Jack Williams, and I think he could be a really, really good signing for Para. On the other hand, they are losing Captain Clint Gutherson, Ethan Sanders, Blaze Talangi, Dejan Arce, Zach Sini, Regan Campbell-Gillard, Micah Sevo, Morgan Harper, Ofahiki Ogden, and Makahesi Makatoa. So some, decent size losses in there. Gutherson, Regan Campbell-Gillard, Sevo, but these are guys who appeared to be on the outer for quite some time at the Eels, particularly Gutherson. There was such a saga around him. The Eels wanting an X-Factor fullback. Talangi signed with the Panthers, decently far out. Arce was in and out of the side. Regan Campbell-Gillard, that was a bit more, sudden. And I think he will be a bit more hard to replace, but not irreplaceable. And Micah Sevo, a guy who was so loved at the start of his career with Parramatta, but Parramatta fans completely turned off him by the end. So I don't think he's a tremendous loss for them. Getting into their best 17, I've got Isaiah Ayongi at fullback, Bailey Simonson and Josh Adokar on the wings, Will Pensini and Zach Lomax in the centres, with Dylan Brown and Mitch Moses, of course, in the halves. The front row, I've got Junior Paulo and Jack Williams, with Brendan Hands in at hooker. Back rowers, I've got Kelma Tuolangi and Bryce Cartwright, and Jermaine Hopgood, of course, coming in at lock, a player who I'm expecting to have a big year statistically. He'll have to shoulder probably a bit of that burden that was left by Regan Campbell-Gillard. Then looking to the bench, you've got Joey Lussick in at 14, Ryan Madison, Sean Lane, and the great Viramu Greg in jersey 17. I think that's one of the stronger benches in this competition. Lussick is high quality enough to be a bench hooker, and you've got two very good back rowers in Sean Lane and Ryan Madison. And while there's definitely question marks around Greg, I think the fact that Parramatta were willing to let go of Regan Campbell-Gillard is a sign that they do have faith in him. So I'm backing him to hopefully come of age this year. Looking at their upsides, they've got undoubted quality. They've got the second best halves pairing in the league, in my opinion, as well as that recruitment drive. They face some challenges in that they've got the new coach and a significant change in leadership. This side was defined by the likes of Brad Arthur and Clint Gutherson in recent years, and they're now gone. So although you could argue things had got a bit stale under the leadership of those two and a change was needed, there'll definitely be a transition period, but I do expect Parramatta will bounce back in a very big way this year. For the Titans, they're bringing in Carter Gordon from the Melbourne Rebels, as well as Regan Campbell-Gillard, as we just mentioned, from the Parramatta Eels. And just touching on Big Reg, that to me is very exciting, because a strength of the Titans up until this point in recent history has been their forward pack. The likes of Tino Fa'asuamaleaui, David Fifita, Moaki Fotuaika, Beau Fermor. They've got high-quality options there, and adding Regan Campbell-Gillard to that, if Reg can find, the form that he's had over the last few years of the Eels, that's going to be a really, really good signing. And when you've got the punch of Tino Fotuaika and Campbell-Gillard coming at you, that's as hard to stop as any other forward pack in the competition. So with Des Hazard looking to implement a hard-nosed edge up there on the Gold Coast, that's a really astute signing. And then you've got Carter Gordon. I think he's under a little bit of an injury cloud at the moment, but he's played a little bit of 5/8, I believe, in the Queensland Cup, as well as some centre. The boys in the Bloke in a Bar podcast said that he's potentially big enough to play in the lock role. So he just seems like a very versatile guy. And as I mentioned earlier, in the modern game, that's so important to have. I don't think he works his way onto the bench. They've just got too many options there. Although potentially now with the injury to Kieran Foran, he may. But he'll be a very solid squad option, I think, for the Titans. On the other hand, they are losing Tanner Boyd, Aaron Clark, both to the Warriors, Isaac Liu and Keenan Palacia over to the Super League, Seth Nicotimo, Joe Stimson, and Tom Weaver. No huge losses there. I do really like Aaron Clark. I think he would have been a good ball-playing 13 for them, but they've got Chris Randall, who for me will fill that role, and Tanner Boyd, very highly touted coming through, but it evidently just wasn't working. So I don't think there's any massive losses there for the Gold Coast Titans. Moving into their best 17, the fullback, he well and truly picks himself in the form of Keanu Keeney. On the wings, you've got Alafiana Khan Pereira, the prolific try scorer, and Phil Sami, who I think is a very underrated winger. The centers, I've gone with Brian Kelly and Jojo Fifita. 5/8, AJ Brimson, one of my favorite players in the league. And halfback, they're going to go with Jaden Campbell with the foreign injury now. I'm willing to see how that goes. If Jerome Hughes can be the best halfback in the league, then, I'm not ruling out any style of player, and certainly not Jaden Campbell, but he is certainly going to be an unorthodox style. Gold Coast will be going all-out attack, all-out flair, and they've got the ability to do that. They've got the cattle to do that, but we'll see just how much it pays off. Now, in the front row, this is interesting. I'm moving Tino Fa'asuamaleaui from the 13 jersey to the number 8 jersey. To me, I just want to simplify his role. I don't want him to be worrying necessarily about all this ball playing stuff. He's good at it, but I think it might distract from his strength, which is his physicality. Get him through the middle. I'm not saying just use him as a battering ram, because he is better than that, but allow him to assert himself in the front row without having to really worry about the players around him so much. And I'd pair him with Regan Campbell-Gillard to start in what would be one of the better opening front row pairings any team has. Premiership winner Sam Verrills lines up at hooker. Back row also picked themselves in the form of Beau Fermor and David Fifita. And as I mentioned earlier, Chris Randall would be the lock for me. I love these ball-playing locks. These smaller guys are one of my favorite genres of players, and Randall fits that perfectly to me. And if they are going to go with a more attacking style, I do think having a guy like Randall in that position for a bit of extra ball playing would be really, really effective. The bench, I mean, number 14, Kieran Foran, although I've mentioned a few times now his injury, he will be there in their best 17. Then you've got as well Mo Fotuweka, the Origin representative, Jamin Jolliffe, and for the last position in jersey 17, I've gone with a guy who's got a bit of versatility. Can play in the middle, can play in the back row, could play probably centers at a pinch. Jacob Arlick-Vinke. I think he's a very, very explosive player. I love him every single time he plays for the PNG Kummels, and I really hope he gets a proper run in first grade this year. The things I'd be looking forward to this year if I was a Titans fan, I mean, obviously you've got the return of Tino, which is huge. Not just from the quality that he provides, but the leadership that he provides. The kind of impact that people talk about where you're sitting in the dressing room and you're nervous or whatever, and you look across the sheds and you see a particular guy. Tino for the Titans is that guy. You look at him and you're like, okay, we'll be all right. We'll survive here. So that influence for a side like the Titans, who, you know, are known to find themselves on the back foot, I think is absolutely massive. And as I mentioned earlier, the attacking upside that this side has now, absolutely massive with Campbell in at halfback particularly, but they do have to pick and stick, I think. I mean, one of my big criticisms of sides all the time is just chopping and changing. We just don't see it pay off. We don't see it work, ever. And if they are going to go with Jaden Campbell at halfback, you need to give him time. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying he's completely, invincible in that position. I'm not saying play him for 24 games, even if he's absolutely terrible. But at least give him half a season. At least. You have to give a guy like that time to put the hours, the game time in to a specialized position like halfback and learn it. You can train all you want, but playing a game is completely different, particularly at the NRL level. So I back Des Hasler to do that. I think he's an experienced enough coach to, but he will certainly need to, I believe. And not to mention as well, and I think this is the biggest thing, there is a losing culture at the Titans. They are the smallest team that we have in the NRL. They have never really achieved any meaningful amount of success. I believe they made a preliminary final back in 2010, but it's 15 years ago, you know. So it's been a very, very long time between drinks for the Titans, and that does play in the back of the minds of the players, you know, when they wear that Titans jersey and think about what it represents. So that's going to take a significant cultural shift to turn that around, but again, I do rate Hasler very highly, and with a second preseason with these Titans boys, I think he'll go a very, very long way towards making that change happen. Next up, we've got the Wars, a side who, obviously after a very lofty finish in 2023, struggled in 2024 with injuries and just the same players couldn't quite find the form that they once did. But their recruitments are quite decent. I mean, obviously, James Fisher-Harris coming in. I will talk about him a bit more in depth later. And it is somewhat offset by the departure of Fanua Blake. But he is nonetheless a brilliant signing for them. Aaron Clark, though, is a guy who I think is very, very good. I mentioned in the main channel video how he's essentially coming in to replace Jazz Tavanga, but I actually think Clark is a better player than Tavanga is, and I do think he will nail down, especially now that Tohu Harris has retired, that lock position. And to me, from an attacking perspective, as good as Harris was with his ball playing, Clark is better. Clark is, you know, a hooker by trade. So I think that will be a very positive change for the Warriors. I thought as well that the signing of Tanner Boyd would prove to be quite important for the Wars, because originally looking at their kicking options with the likes of Tamaide Martin, Chanel Harris-Tavita, and Luke Metcalf, I didn't see a really good long-distance kicking game. Tanner Boyd provides that, but he didn't really get a run as such in the trials, so it doesn't look like they're going to go with him in that halfback jersey. Potentially he could come off the bench, but you do have the likes of Dylan Walker there as well, so sort of tough to see where he fits in, but it could be a decent signing. In terms of their departures, Marcelo Montoya returns to the Bulldogs, as well as Zion Maiu, Aiden Fanua-Blake to the Sharks, Jester Vanga to Manly, and Sean Johnson and Tohu Harris both retiring. For their 17, I've gone with Charnze Nicoll-Klokstad at fullback. There's been a lot of people saying that Roger Tuivasa-Sheck should play there, and it's not an idea that I dislike at all, but I do think that you can get the best out of Roger at the same time on the wing. So that is where I've named him, as well as obviously Dallin Watene-Zelezniak. I do think that it is outrageous that a back three could have three surnames: Nicoll-Klokstad, Watene-Zelezniak, and Tuivasa-Sheck. And to be honest, I just kind of wanted to make that happen. As well, in the centers, you've got Ali Leitawa. And for the other center position, it's a little interesting, right? So I've gone with Rocco Berry, who I think is their best option, but he's under a massive injury cloud right now after injuring his shoulder. Does not look like he'll be ready to play first grade anytime soon, and potentially could sit out a lot of this year. So I wouldn't go with, well, I mean, I would go with Berry, but they won't go with Berry in that position. They're very keen on Pompey, who does a job. He's okay. He's decent, not particularly exciting. I might be inclined to try and get a little bit more experience into the likes of Ed Corsi instead. But we'll see who they go with in that role. In the halves, I've got Tamaide Martin in at 5'8" and Luke Metcalf in at halfback, which I thought would be the way they went in Vegas. They instead went with Harris-Tavita at 5'8", but in the trials it was Tamaide Martin, so that did surprise me. Front row, Fisher Harris and Mitch Barnett. Very good front row combination, but I'd say only as good as Adam Fanua-Blake and Mitch Barnett were last year. Back row, I've got Marata Niukore and Jackson Ford. Ford, a guy who wasn't that great for them last year and will be looking to bounce back in a big way in 2025. Aaron Clark, as I mentioned earlier, in that ball playing lock role. Then at 14, I've got Dylan Walker. And the rest of the squad, I've got Kurt Catewell, Bunty Afoa, and Jacob Laban, who was a back rower we saw play for the Maori All-Stars. I think he's really, really impressive for a young guy, having played the very, very small amount of games that he already has. So they didn't go with him for the Vegas game, which has interested me, but it would not surprise me at all if over the course of this season he works his way into that team. Getting into the big talking points now, there is going to be a major culture shift with James Fisher-Harris coming in. I mean, as I've mentioned, on paper it's offset by Fanua-Blake departing, but in terms of the culture that Fanua-Blake and Fisher-Harris each provide, Fish has him covered by far. And that's going to be very, very important for a Warriors side transitioning into a new era, post-SJ, post-Tohu Harris. As I said in the main channel video, I do think it could be some time before we actually do see those benefits show for the Warriors. I think it could be a number of years. You have young players coming through, learning those habits that Fisher-Harris is giving them, but they will have high expectations for themselves right from the get-go. The only real downside I see is the halves combination. It's not particularly exciting. They do have a number of options, as I said: Metcalf, Harris-Tavita, Tamaide Martin, and Tanner Boyd, but none of those guys are really like exciting, high-quality first graders. I'd say, beyond Flanagan and Ilias at the Dragons, Metcalf and Harris-Tavita is, one of the lower exciting halves combinations in the league, and we know how important halves are. So it's quite possible that over the course of the season, we might see Nicoll-Klokstad work his way into the halves and Tuivasa-Sheck end up at fullback. A lot of people do like that option. To me, CNK just doesn't ball play enough when he's in the 5'8" role. It looks a bit like when we see Joseph Manu play 5'8" and he just wouldn't pass the ball. So that's not an option I'm a huge fan of, to be honest. But hopefully, I do really hope that Luke Metcalf can become the halfback that the Warriors evidently seem to think he can be. For the Brisbane Broncos, quite a limited recruitment drive, really, bringing in Hayes Perham to replace the outgoing Tristan Saylor and Ben Hunt. It was obviously a little bit of a last-minute decision, but a very good one. If he's prepared to be playing hooker, which by reports it looks like he will, they will have a spine of Reece Walsh, Ezra Mam, Adam Reynolds, and Ben Hunt. If you extend it as well, Patrick Carrigan at lock. That is incredibly high quality. That is very, very exciting. And although he is 34 years of age now, this is the year for the Broncos. They've got the side to do it. I firmly believe on paper. So he only needs 1 or 2 good seasons left in him to have a really good stab at a premiership up there in Brisbane. As I mentioned, Tristan Saylor does depart the club, as well as the retirements of wingers Corey Oates and Jordan Pereira. Now, for their best 17, I've obviously got Reece Walsh in at fullback. He's the Queensland fullback as well. On the wings, so I've gone with Jesse Arthurs and Selwyn Cobbo. Now, Cobbo was named on the wing in the trials. I initially thought I might go with him in the centres and Dean Mariner on the wing, but it seems like Michael Maguire fancies Cobbo as a bit more of a winger. Which does mean the centres are Mariner and Katoni Staggs, although we have just found out Staggs will be injured for the first period of the season. In the halves, Ezra Mam, obviously returning from his off-field indiscretion, let's call it. But, all that aside, he is a very talented player. So a very high-quality 5/8 option for Brisbane, and Adam Reynolds at halfback. In the front row, the same as last year. Payne Haas, obviously, I think is the best front rower in the league, picks himself. And Corey Jensen, probably the most underrated front rower in the league. So many people just don't have an appreciation of what Jensen has done for the Broncos in recent years. Back rowers, Jordan Ricky and Brendan Piakura. I have heard some rumors that Piakura might not be starting for them. And they're prioritising likes of, say, Jack Gajewski, but Gajewski doesn't even make my side. I think Piakura definitely should be the priority. And Patrick Carrigan picks himself at lock. On the bench, originally I had Blake Moser, but Moser is under a massive injury cloud as well. Lots of injuries coming into this season already. So Corey Pakes is the way I've gone. And then you've got some exciting young forwards in the form of Xavier Willison, Kobe Hetherington, and Ben Takura, who's a guy who I'm very excited to see under Michael Maguire, see how an experienced coach like that, who knows how to get the best out of players, treats a youngster who's very raw, but my God, has the physical attributes to be absolutely unstoppable. That side, looking at it, it's got undoubted quality in it, but I think the crucial ingredient could be the fact that they've got a point to prove, a real point to prove. We still don't really know what went wrong at Brisbane last year. We don't. And I don't even know if they necessarily would know, because if they did know, you'd assume that they would have fixed it. So those players of that quality, they'll know that if they have another season where they're around the middle of the table, it's not good enough. Their reputations as players will begin to fall off. So they'll be absolutely raring to get back up to where this side should be on paper, which is, pushing for top 4, definitely. In terms of the coaching, that to me is also a strength. I never rated Kevin Walters all that highly as a coach. His achievement in getting the Broncos to the 2023 grand final was very, very good. And I rate him, I rate that achievement very highly. I remember saying to a friend once that I essentially consider Kevin Walters to technically be a premiership winning coach, because he did everything you would have to do to win a premiership. In some ways, that's the esteem, I guess, that people should hold him in. But no, cut all that. That was just no. In terms of the coaching as well, I think that is a strength. While Kevin Walters' achievement in getting them to the 2023 grand final was very, very good, I've never rated him all that highly as a coach. He doesn't seem to be a particularly hands-on kind of guy, a particularly tactical kind of guy. And watching his press conferences after the games, I was never all that impressed with his responses. On the other hand, Michael Maguire seems to be very, very effective. A lot of people will point towards what he did with the Tigers in his last head coaching stint in the NRL, but we have to view that in context. At the time, it was seen as a failure that he was only able to get the Tigers to the middle of the table, could not get them to the finals. But now, in hindsight, looking at the state of that club organizationally, and the roster as well that Michael Maguire had in those years, he was working miracles, in my opinion. He was doing a really, really outstanding job, and we saw him do it at South Sydney as well. We saw him obviously lead them to their first premiership in several decades. So I back him massively as a head coach. As a New South Welshman, I was absolutely devastated to see him leave the Blues, but what he'll do for Brisbane is really, really an exciting prospect for Broncos fans. The question, though, is whether the playing group will be able to adjust in time for them to have a finish near the top end of the table, because it is a very drastic shift in styles between the laid-back approach Walter's brought and this kind of, more military mentality, almost drill sergeant style that Michael Maguire is said to have. I think that will get the best eventually out of these very talented, particularly the young Broncos, guys like Reece Walsh, who, while, Kevy was able to let the shackles go on a guy like Walsh, potentially, a bit more discipline could be needed. Him and Selwyn Cobo were leading the NRL in errors, I believe, in 2023, or at least they were very, very high up in that statistic. So could be good for Madge to kind of just get them a little bit more disciplined, get them, instead of just throwing the kitchen sink at everything, picking their moments and building a bit more of a game plan and sticking to what the team want to do. And, that will be helped by having Adam Reynolds there, who's obviously a premiership winner under Michael Maguire. They've got a good relationship between the two of them. They've got a winning relationship between the two of them. Reynolds should be able to successfully implement out on the field what Madge wants to implement from the training ground. So I'm expecting good things for Brisbane this year. For the Dragons, and they are one of the only two teams, along with the Tigers, who I think every single player that they have signed is a very good key signing for their team. You've got Damien Cook and Lachlan Ilias coming in from the Rabbitohs, Valentine Holmes coming in from the Cowboys, Clint Gutherson from the Eels, Emery Gula from the Raiders, and David Clemmer from the Tigers. So, Cook, Illawarra Jr., he's coming definitely towards the back end of his career, but last season, although his team didn't go very well at South Sydney, I think he did a solid enough job. He was serviceable. We don't see that dynamic running game, which was, his strength for such a long period of time, but he will bring a lot of leadership to this Dragon side, which I think could be really, really important for them. They did have Jacob Little at hooker last year, who did a very good job, but there's ways that you could work those two into a bit of a 1-2 punch. Lachlan Ilias will line up probably in the 5/8 jersey with Carl Flanagan at halfback. He's a guy with upside, right? We haven't seen it in the NRL yet, but he was in a very, very high pressure position, filling in that halfback jersey for South Sydney after Adam Reynolds departed the club. Now the shackles are off. He's on a side that doesn't have particularly high expectations, alongside a halves partner who's at a similar kind of level to him. I think, we could see him a bit more liberated this year, maybe see the Lachlan Ilias that a lot of people thought we'd be seeing when he first came into first grade. Val Holmes, still a very high quality centre, and goal kicking wise, great replacement for Zach Lomax. I think that was a really, really astute recruitment, as well as jumping on the opportunity to sign Clint Gutherson. He already, I think, you can see, no, it's that side. You can see there, it just looks good, I think, in a Dragons jersey. It kind of looks like it works. So I'm excited about the leadership he will bring to the side. Him and Cook have been named the captains, but they've obviously had Tyrell Sloan there at the fullback position for quite some years now, and he's had an up and down career in first grade. At his moments, but his leadership from the back definitely wouldn't be a strong suit, whereas Gutherson, that's his forte. That's what he brings. So that's very good. Emre Gula, he might not be a starting front rower. He could well be, but he will at least come off the bench for them, as well as David Clemmer. Now, that one sort of came out of nowhere to me, but although I did say it wasn't really working out so well at the Tigers relative to his pay packet, he was performing quite well. He was performing well enough to warrant a first-grade position, and all he has to do is continue that at the Dragons and, let the impact responsibilities fall more to the guys like Jaden Sewer, for example. In terms of the departure list, they've got Zach Lomax and Ben Hunt, obviously the two major ones. They're losing a few other guys, Savelio Tamale to the Raiders, Max Fianet to the Dolphins, nearly said Dragons there, Alec Tuitavake and Jesse Marshke, but those guys aren't first graders, or at least they weren't for the Dragons last year, so it is Lomax and Hunt who are the two big ones. Lomax, very big loss, obviously, but as I said, Holmes will replace the goal-kicking responsibilities at least, and it might make them actually a bit more of a balanced side. Lomax was their go-to guy last year. So much went through him, and it worked, but, with the preseason to figure that out, there could be teams that, could have worked out the Dragons a little bit if they had stuck to that game plan. And Ben Hunt, it just wasn't a happy marriage. I wouldn't question the effort that he put in at the Dragons, but I think it's best that those two parties just moved on for sure. Probably a number of years overdue, to be honest with you. They're 17. Clint Gutherson in at fullback. On the wings, I've gone with Tyrell Sloan and Christian Tuipulotu. Tuipulotu I love. I think he's just such a energetic, passionate player. You can see how much he cares about his Dragons. Sloan on the wing, so Michaeli Ravalawa is a player I'm a big fan of, and I think last year he did receive a very unfair amount of hate for the fact that he wasn't scoring as many tries, but they moved him to the other wing, right? So that is a very major thing for a winger. Suddenly everything's backwards. But it does look like Sloan's the way they'll go there, and he is a very promising player. He's got a lot more potential in the future than Ravalawa does, so I completely understand that. Their center pairing, super strong. Valentine Holmes and Moses Sully, who is a player that's found a lot of consistency over recent years in his career. That's exciting. The halves, as I said, not quite as exciting. You've got Flanagan and Ilias. I personally think that Flanagan at the halfback jersey hasn't really worked throughout his career, despite the fact that I maintain he essentially played halfback last year for the Dragons, but it's just wearing the 7 jersey brings so much extra pressure. That being said, it looks like that's the way they've gone, because in the trials they consistently named Flanagan at 7 and Ilias at 6, so I'm happy to go with that. Front row, I've gone with 2 new boys, Emre Gula and David Clemmer, just to soak up a bit of that early pressure with Damien Cook in at hooker. The back row, these guys are explosive. Luciano Leilua and Jaden Sewer and Jack DeBellin in at lock, which means you've got a bench of Jacob Little, who will be the best bench hooker in the Premiership. Raymond Fatala Mariner, who was very good for them last year. I've got potentially both Couchmans even in the next 2 positions, both Ryan and Toby. It just sort of depends on the versatility that they can provide, and where the Dragons want to invest their bench spots, whether they want 2 front rowers or 2 back rowers. But you can go with Eisenhuth as well in that position. Blake Laurie, I think, is probably a little bit unlucky to miss out. So I've gone with a Couchman and an Eisenhuth in those roles, but Couchman the second and Blake Laurie probably unlucky to miss out. Wouldn't be surprised if either of those guys made that 17. They've recruited a lot of experience, right? We've seen experience and leadership, and got rid of the guys who don't want to be there. And now you've got a high quality coach like Shane Flanagan in the building, with a team that has been shaped by him. He's got his side now, as well as the fact that you've got a very, very good hooker rotation, as I mentioned earlier, between Damien Cook and Jacob Little. So there's very little excuses for the Dragons. Although I've predicted quite a lowly finish for them, they'll certainly have high expectations of themselves internally. Then you've got, in terms of the areas that are a little bit more concerning, as I mentioned, the Haas pairing. But what I do want to mention is that Shane Flanagan last season did wonders with Jacob Little. When Jacob Little signed for the Dragons, he was a guy who didn't work out at the Tigers, was sort of in a bit of a rotation with a few other hookers at the time there. Simkin, that's the name I was forgetting. Even De Silva was getting, a run here and there. So it wasn't really working out. And then last season, he became one of the most form hookers in the Premiership. So if Shane Flanagan can have a similar kind of impact on Lachlan Ilias, that would be absolutely game-changing for the Dragons, both for this season and moving forward into the future. For the Dolphins, as I mentioned in the main channel video, pretty solid recruitment drive. Junior Tupou from the Tigers, Kulikefu Finifuyaki from the Cowboys, Daniel Saifidi from the Knights, and Max Fianet from the Dragons. Fianet, I don't think will make the 17. Tupou, I think, probably will. Particularly, we saw Jack Bostock go down with a bit of an injury in one of the trials. So, his fitness throughout the course of the season will be a little bit more under question. But Kulikefu Finifuyaki is one of the most exciting young back rowers in the Premiership, in my opinion. He's not like a big, tall, lanky back rower or anything, but pound for pound, he just provides so much power. And for the Dolphins, who are a side who have back rowers like Kenny Bromwich and Felice Kaufusi, who throughout their career have been very, very good, but they're at the back end of their career now for sure. Bringing in Finifuyaki is just such an astute recruitment, in my opinion, sets up the future brilliantly. And I think even, in the present, this year, he will play a really very good role for the Dolphins this season. Then you've got Daniel Saifidi, who's replacing the retired Jesse Bromwich. That's, a very, very good replacement because Saifidi, in recent years, we've seen it get a little bit stale for him at Newcastle, but an origin player at his best. If all he needs is a change of scenery, like the amount of value that they could get, I doubt they would have had to pay very much to get him out of Newcastle. So that could be very, very good for the Dolphins. Moving on to their departures, you've got Ewan Aitken departing for South Sydney, which I think is actually quite a big loss. But as we said earlier, Finifuyaki will offset that somewhat. Tavita Pangai Jr., Anthony Milford, Tessie New, Valencia Tafare, Jesse Bromwich, and Edric Lee. The only other one aside from Aitken there that I think is a big loss is Bromwich. And it's not necessarily the on-field stuff, right? Because that's replaced by Saifidi, but it's the leadership. The Dolphins will now need guys like Felice Kaufusi and Kenny Bromwich to step up quite a bit more and be the figureheads for this team moving forward. For their best 17, obviously Hamito Tabuaifido at fullback. On the wings, I have gone with Jermaine Asako and Jack Bostock, but as I said, injury cloud over Bostock, so Junior Tupou could well end up in that squad somewhere. In the centers, Jake Avarillo and Herbie Farnworth. Farnworth obviously picks himself, and Avarillo, I've kind of been waiting for him to hit that next level for a long time. In the trials, they picked him in the centers, and I'm glad to see him get another go, and I really hope he'll do it this year, because I think there's a hell of a player there inside Jake Avarillo. In the halves, you got Cody Nikorima and Isaiah Katoa. Nikorima just has to do his job, really. Katoa is going from strength to strength in his career. In the front row, Felice Kaufusi rumored to be moving into that position, and I think it makes sense to kind of simplify his role a little bit as he gets towards the back end of his career. And since this is a best 17, I've got Tom Flegler in the front row as well. But, again, I keep saying injury cloud. He's under a tremendous one. Almost didn't feature at all last year. There were rumors of retirement, which would just be absolutely tragic. Those seem to have faded a bit, and he's committed to fighting his way back to the NRL paddock. But we at least won't be seeing him for quite some time. If he's not there, you start the Saifiti brother. In at hooker, you've got Jeremy Marshall-King, one of the best hookers in the competition these days. Back row, I've got Connolly Lemuelu And I've gone with Tom Gilbert. A lot of people would have Tom Gilbert in at lock, but at lock, I've got like a guy who I just adore watching. He extended with the Dolphins today. It's Max Plath. They call him the Psychopath, and it is just a perfect nickname for him. He embodies everything that the Dolphins have tried to build so far in their short history. He's a tackling machine. He's so passionate. I love him in that role as a ball-playing lock as well. Very, very good in that position. On the bench, then, that leaves Ray Stone in at 14, Kuli Kafu Finifuyaki. You have Saifidi if Flegler is in the side, and Kenny Bromwich in at jersey number 17. So in terms of their upsides, the return of Tom Gilbert has to be spoken about. Everyone in the rugby league world just hopes that he can stay fit. Seeing him go down with an injury, and from memory, it was the preseason challenge last year, was just terrible. It was gut-wrenching stuff. You just want to see him have a good run because he's an origin player at his best. He's played for the Maroons, so we all want to see him get back to that level. The other upside I want to talk about is Christian Wolff. He is a very, very good head coach. Australian fans would know him based on what he's done with Tonga, which has been extremely impressive. Don't get me wrong. Like, I cannot commend him enough for what he's done for International Rugby League with that side. But he's also coached at the club level before. He's won the Super League with St. Helens before as part of their big, from memory, it was four premierships in a row. And he's still got connections over there. They've just signed Morgan Knowles, who will come over next season from St. Helens to the Dolphins. So he's very, very highly regarded over there, and it would not surprise me whatsoever, and I do expect that he will prove to be a good head coach at the NRL level as well. The downside is this infamous post-Wayne downturn that teams seem to go down. South Sydney have been the latest victim of it, but before that you had the likes of the Broncos, to a level, depends how long you want to delay it. You had Newcastle, obviously. So we'll see whether the Dolphins do fall victim to that as well. I think everyone is kind of hoping that they don't, because the Dolphins kind of haven't existed long enough for people to really dislike them yet. But you've got that and the leadership void that Wayne Bennett does leave, as well as the leadership void that Jesse Bromwich leaves in terms of the playing group. I mentioned earlier with the Eels that they were so synonymous with Brad Arthur and Clint Gutherson. The Dolphins are Wayne Bennett and Jesse Bromwich. So, this is a new era now for the Finns, and we'll see whether they can effectively transition into this new phase of their history. Next up, we've got the Raiders, and as usual, no major recruitments for them. They do struggle to attract guys to come down and live in Canberra, although I'm a Canberra local. It's fine here. I love living here. Very livable city. And NRL players, if you do want to come down to Canberra, you won't regret it. It's pretty awesome. Anyway, so their recruitments, they brought in a number of young guys. You've got Ethan Sanders coming in from Parramatta, Miles Martin from Newcastle, Savelio Tamale, who has been named to start for Canberra in their Vegas fixture this Sunday, and Matty Nicholson, who's been brought in from the Warrington Wolves. He's one I want to highlight because he's essentially a replacement for Elliot Whitehead. Very good sort of succession planning there from Canberra, bringing in another English back rower. In the trials, he had decent moments. He also had some moments that weren't very good. But I've spoken to people who watch the Super League more closely than me, and he's seen to be a player who should adapt decently well to the NRL the requirements of playing NRL, the speed of the game, the physicality of the game. It might take some time. It always sort of does, but he could be a player who is occupying that back row position for quite a long time down in the nation's capital. In terms of departures, they've got a number of players who were playing first grade for them, but no one too significant. You've got Nick Kotrich, Elliot Whitehead, towards the end of his career, very good player, but at the back end. Hohe Papuru, James Schiller, Zach Wilford, Jordan Rapana. He will be missed, but as well, he's age 35 to my knowledge. So, you'd think that his performances would have started to drop off anyway. He's over with Hull FC now in the Super League. Peter Holler, Aiden Trevelyan, and Emre Gula. Gula is one who we would see regularly featured in the 17 for Canberra. And, while I do think he does a decent job, he's not one that I particularly think is going to be missed by a side that has Joseph Tapine, Josh Papali'i, Trey Mooney coming through. Even you look to the likes of Arta Mariota and Pasami Sola, I don't think they're going to miss Emre Gula to a huge extent. So moving on to their best 17, I've got Kyle Weeks in at fullback for them. Makes sense. He moved there in sort of the back half of last season and excelled in that role. His speed in that position is brilliant. I've gone with Albert Hopewati on the wing. As I mentioned, for Vegas, they've gone with Savelio Tamale, but I think Hopewati has gone from strength to strength in his Raiders career so far. So I would hope to see him return to the side soon. Sebastian Chris is one of Ricky's favourite players, so him and Matt Timoko are in the centres with Xavier Savage on the other wing. The halves, I've stuck with Ethan Strange and Jamal Fogarty. There's a lot of people saying get Ethan Sanders in there, but having watched Ethan Sanders play a decent amount, I think him and Fogarty are too similar. They're too organizational. They're too structured. Whereas Ethan Strange playing alongside Fogarty is just an attacking weapon. We saw it a lot last year. And while, potentially in the future he could move to center, I don't think the time has come for that just yet. The front row almost picks itself, really. Joe Tapine and Josh Papali'i. And I've gone with Tom Starling in to start and hooker. I'm a pretty big Starling fan. For the rest of the side, in the back row, Hudson Young and Matty Nicholson, who we spoke about earlier, and Morgan Smithies, who has been very serviceable in his time so far at lock for the Canberra Raiders, gets through his tackles well. Nothing too flashy, but, when you play a Canberra Raiders style of footy, you also don't need to be that flashy. You just get through your work, and the points will come. On the bench, I've gone with Owen Patty, who is one of the most highly touted young hookers in the world. Probably, you got Blake Moser, I suppose. I don't want to get too excited, but Owen Patty is highly regarded, and he has nabbed that 14 spot for Vegas, which I was very, very excited to see after his impressive trial form. You as well got Corey Horsburgh there on the bench. Obviously a guy who can play middle, can play back row as well. And after a very troubled season last year, by all reports, he has had a tremendous preseason and is a guy who I'm expecting a heap of improvement from this year. Filling out the squad, I've got Arta Mariota and Trey Mooney. Mooney's one in particular who seems to have been on the precipice of breaking out now for 2 or 3 years. So I'm hoping for a big 2025 from him, because it could, get to a stage where it's a little bit make or break. He's still very young, and we do tend to see forwards kick on, a little bit later into their careers, but he's had opportunities now. And while he's currently living on a lot of potential, as time does take on, that sort of perception of potential does tend to go away a little bit. So he will need a big year for himself this season. Editing Leaguie here, just wanted to mention that I completely forgot about Zach Hosking. He's someone I rate very highly. I would be starting him in the back row alongside Hudson Young and have Matty Nicholson coming off the bench, probably in place of Arta Mariota. This is just a side that always seem to overachieve, no matter what. And it's why, I love coming to Raiders games down here in Canberra. I love watching them play, watching their style. They are just so physical. They are so determined. And we see how much the team means to their coach, Ricky Stewart, and how much Ricky Stewart means to their team. It is pretty special to watch. And, no significant losses. So culturally, there shouldn't be any loss of that kind of mentality. And this side now is much, much more stable than it was 12 months ago. 12 months ago, we didn't know who their 5/8 was going to be. It was between Ethan Strange and Kyle Weeks. They had, rumors of Jordan Rapana being a fullback, but Seb Chris had played fullback for quite a while. There were concerns about their hooker position. Zach Wilford had done a good job. Danny Levi seemed to be the favorite, but all the fans like Tom Starling. Either way, all that's gone now. They've figured it all out. And so there's still competition for spots. Not everyone is completely locked in, but the key positions are stable. And that to me is very exciting for the Canberra Raiders. The concerns that I potentially have for them is the leadership void that they now have with Elliot Whitehead leaving the club, Jordan Rapiner leaving the club, even Nick Cottridge, while he wasn't playing first grade, was an experienced guy for the dressing room, but it shouldn't be too much trouble. The other aspect is that on paper they are relatively weak, but as I mentioned, they always are, and they always overachieve. So I haven't got too many concerns for Canberra this year. I think they'll fall down the ladder just a tad because other teams around them will improve. But still a side that I'm really looking forward to watching a lot of this year. Moving on now to the teams that finished last year in the top 8, and we start with the Newcastle Knights, a side who I am not high on this year. They are my prediction for the wooden spoon, and I'll get into that a bit later, but just looking at their recruitment that brought in Tyrone Thompson, Taj Annan, and James Schiller. Schiller from the Raiders, Thompson from Rugby Union. I cannot say I've seen any of Thompson, but he is the brother of Leo Thompson, who is one of probably their best front row forward up there at the Newcastle Knights. So if Tyrone can replicate at all what his brother has created up there in Newcastle, it's an exciting prospect. And James Schiller, a guy who I think is a very high quality guy for outside back depth. He may well win a starting spot now that Fletcher Sharp seems to be rusted into that 5/8 jersey. But we'll see how that all unfolds. In terms of the departures, Daniel Saifidi, a significant loss. I think that's you can't really gloss over that. But as I mentioned earlier, potentially had got a bit stale for him up there in Newcastle. So a change of scenery might be beneficial for everybody involved. You've then got Miles Martin, who's departed to the Raiders, David Armstrong over to the Super League, Anari Tuwala to the Dogs, and Christian Mapapalangi, who is currently unsigned. So that leaves them with the best 17 of obviously Kalen Ponga in at fullback. As I mentioned, I do have James Schiller on that first wing. Not the most physical guy, but rapid. He is super fast. So if he can nail down that spot, he could be very, very effective for the Knights. Gagai and Bradman Best in the centres, obviously two Origin caliber players, with Greg Marju on the wing for them. 5/8 Fletcher Sharp. Now, I am such a rusted on Will Price enthusiast that this took a lot of doing to type in the word Sharp in the 5/8 jersey. I wanted it to be Will, but his trial form was good. I mean, it completely took everyone by surprise, I think, that didn't watch him coming through, because he seemed to be a really, really good winger at the back end of last year, and now they're moving him into 5/8. But he was quick. That trial against the Roosters, he was very, very impressive. I only managed to catch the highlights, I will admit, but the scoring plays that he provided were very, very electric. So I think he'll line up next to Jack Cogger in the halves, Cogger being probably the most organizational option that they have in that position. Front row, Leo Thompson and Saifidi I've gone with, as well as Crosland starting at hooker for me over Jaden Brayley. Back rows, I've got Kai Pearce-Paul and Dylan Lucas. Lucas, who's looking awesome coming into this season. I'm expecting big things from him. At lock, I was torn between two guys, Adam Elliott and Tyson Frizzell, but I did want to find a way to get Frizzell into that starting side, so it was Tyson in the end. Number 14, Jaden Brayley, and then for the rest of the bench, Brodie Jones, Adam Elliott, and Jack Hetherington. Briefly on the upsides, similar to Canberra, they do have a habit of overachieving under Adam O'Brien, and they've got strike players like Ponga, Best, Gagai, Pearce-Paul, even Frizzell to some level. They've got guys that can do it, right? But to me, it's just the big question is the halves instability. Now, a big counter to this, right, is that last season they changed their halves all the time, and they still managed to finish in the top 8. Frankly, I have no idea how they finished in the top 8. It really kind of surprises me. Looking back, I was like, what the hell are they doing there? And they nearly beat the Cowboys in week 1 as well. But to me, that's not the rule. That's the exception to the rule. That was an anomaly, right? An anomaly. Let's try saying that 5 times quickly. So, they should be picking and sticking. I said this before, based on another team, but with halves like a guy like Fletcher Sharp, for example, who is young, who is inexperienced, putting him in first grade for 5 games and then dropping him, that burns him. That burns him so much. The confidence will be shot. Back him. Put him in that position and back him. Newcastle are not going to win a premiership this year, okay? We know that. And I tend to be of the mind that if your team isn't going to win the premiership this year, your only focus should be setting up to win a premiership. Don't try and pick the best team for now so that you can maybe finish in the top 8 and get knocked out in week 1 or 2. Pick the best team for 2 or 3 years' time so that you can win a premiership at that point. That's what they should be doing, in my opinion. And, Knights fans are not going to want to swallow that pill of having to go through another rebuild. And there's certainly a lot of people that have the Knights held in pretty high regard. And I completely understand why, but to me, they need to pick a direction and nail that down. And they failed to do that so far. So I'm not all that optimistic about them. As well, you've got this reliance on Kalen Ponga, which has just never really gone away. And last season his form was very, very good, and he was able to still play around the fact that teams were like organizing just to shut him down. But that won't always be the case. There has been times in his career where teams have figured him out to some extent, and if he gets injured, I've seen his trouble with head knocks over the course of his career. The Knights are in some real trouble. So it's unfortunate, but they're not a side that I'm particularly all that excited about coming into 2025. For the Bulldogs, their recruits are Tom Amone from the Super League, Sitili Tupanua from the Roosters, Marcelo Montoya from the Warriors, as well as Zion Mayu'u from the Warriors, and Inari Tuala from the Knights. No, absolutely massive signings there. Tupanua, I think, will add a bit of quality to their front row, although he does tend to have an error in his game. But potentially coming into a club where he's, a bit more of a senior guy. At the Roosters, he would often sort of play second fiddle to the likes of Angus Crichton, Boyd Cordner more earlier in his career. Whereas at the Bulldogs, while you've got the likes of Jacob Preston and Viliami Kikau, Tupanu was the next guy up in that back row role. So he could thrive under a little bit more of a leadership position. And then Montoya, a guy who I think has displayed pretty impressive form over the Warriors, over the last few years for the Warriors. And he obviously is tasked with filling the void left by Josh Addo-Carr's sudden departure. Is a very, very different style of player, a lot more physical. So it'll be interesting to see whether the Bulldogs' game plan changes at all. But the kick returns that he provides will be very good, and help the Bulldogs get their set started well. They still don't have one of the bigger forward packs in the league, so having a bit more size in their outside backs could be very, very effective. Their losses, Joral Skelton going to the Tigers, Josh Addo-Carr, as we just mentioned, Josh Papali, Jordan Samrani, Kitione Katonga, Zane Tedavano, Pawasa Farmasili, Chris Patolo, Hayes Parham, Liam Knight. That's a clean out. That's a clean out of the, I don't want to say deadwood, that's really quite harsh on a lot of those guys, but guys who were not first grade players at the Dogs, who are taking up roster spots, who are taking up, salary cap percentages, and not really offering all that much. So I think it's really commendable that the Bulldogs have got rid of a number of those guys. Probably the one that stands out as one they wouldn't have wanted to let go is Josh Papali, but he was offered a bit more of a clear path to first grade out there at Parramatta, so it's completely understandable when the Dogs do have the likes of Connor Tracy and Blake Taff on their roster. And speaking of their roster, let's get straight into their 17. Fullback Connor Tracy, after the last season that he put in, he's an automatic in that role. It was only 12 months ago that we didn't know if it was him or Blake Taff, but he's nailed it down. On the wings, Jacob Keras and Marcelo Montoya, although Keras, again, there's a buzzword, injury cloud. We'll see whether he can line up for the first part of the season, but if not, it would probably be the winger, Blake Wilson, who lines up in that role. Centers, Bronson Sherry and Stephen Crichton, both players I think were really, really good last year. And I mean, obviously Crichton deserves his spot, but Sherry had a lot of pressure on him returning from that drug suspension. So I think he deserves some praise for living up to all that. Halves, Matt Burton and Toby Sexton. Toby Sexton's a player I'm going to be watching very closely this year. I mean, he's obviously had a lot of potential coming through the grades at the Gold Coast Titans. And last year was definitely the best year of his career thus far. Can he go to the next level? Because I do think you need a better halfback than Toby Sexton to win an NRL premiership. Toby, though, has improvement in him. So Toby could become a halfback that's better than Toby Sexton. Better than the current version is what I mean. So we'll see whether he does sort of develop into that type of player. But his combination with Matt Burton has just worked out so well for both of them. They both seem to be really enjoying playing alongside each other. So that's good stuff for them. In the front row, you've got Max King, and I've gone with Samuel Hughes, two players who really did impress me last year, as well as Reed Marnie in there at hooker. Back rowers, Viliama Kikau and Jacob Preston, both very high-quality players that I think picked themselves there in the back row positions. And the lock, Kurt Mann. I mean, he proved to be so important for the Doggies last year in terms of that ball-playing role. He's a versatile guy, no doubt about it, but he really nailed down that lock position. He was signed as one of the many utilities that became a bit of a running joke for the poor old Doggies. But while Jaden Salmon was originally slated to be in that role, Kurt Mann absolutely made it his own. Then there's the bench. You've got Bailey Hayward in the 14 jersey, with the rest of the bench being filled up by Satili Tupanua, Josh Curran, and Curtis Morin. There's a couple of guys who are maybe unlucky to miss out. Amone, the new signing, but I just couldn't get rid of Curtis Morin, really. I mean, it gives you a small bench with both Hayward and Morin, but Morin just, he embodies so much of this Dogs of War spirit that you hear them talk about. And we saw him play for the New Zealand Maori as well. So he's moving up in his career, and it's exciting to see for the Dogs. Looking into a bit more specific details for them this year, I mean, the momentum that they'll carry from last year should be huge. As I said in the main channel video, I was concerned they'd be one of these teams that shoot up out of nowhere and then have a drop-off the year later. But talking to people who, know the ins and outs of that club and know what's going on there, it really seems like very exciting signs coming out of the Canterbury Bulldogs right now. The standards that they're setting for themselves compared to last year and years gone by, just completely different. And they are not happy to stay stagnant. They are definitely not happy to drop off. They want to push now for top 4. That's the next step in their story. So they are hell bent on making that happen. And they've got some solid signings to make that happen. And those guys will go into a good system now. Cameron Ciraldo has built a good system out there at the Dogs, which is very much modelled off the Penrith style, the defensive-oriented style that Penrith do provide. But it's a good environment now, the Dogs, and it hasn't been for such a long time. And it shows the value, I suppose, of sticking with a coach, because Ciraldo didn't get it done in his first year. People often compared him to Andrew Webster at the Warriors and how much better Webster was doing. But now, when you look at the positions that the two clubs are in, it's quite clear that Ciraldo was laying the groundwork, the foundations that's allowed for this success. It looks like it's going to be a lot more long-term. The concerns I've got for them, as I mentioned, the second-year syndrome, and this doubt that I have over whether Sexton is good enough to get them competing, at the pointy end of the finals, but I'm absolutely not putting it past him to improve beyond where he is right now and develop into that quality of player. For the Manly Sea Eagles, aside with no huge recruits, no huge losses, they've brought in Joey Walsh from Rugby Union, Jester Bunga from the Warriors, Siwa Taukiaho from the Catalan Dragons, and Michael Cheekham from the South Sydney Rabbitohs, while losing Jackson Paulo to the Cowboys, as well as Carl Lawton to the Cowboys, Jamie Humphreys to Souths, Bailey Hodgson, Ben Condon, Brad Parker, and Aaron Woods. So stability for them. Stability for them is the strength, because they still got their core all completely together. And that has sort of been the case for a number of years now. The core of DCE, the Trebojevic brothers, Hamole Olakawatu, Lachlan Croker, Taniela Paseka, they've all been there for quite some time. They know how to play alongside each other. And after last season, where they unearthed so much depth, the guys like Tommy Talau, for example, who now gives them an issue in the back line where they've got 6 guys that let's make it 5 guys that want to fit into 4 positions. Where you've got Talau, Saab, Garrick, Kohler, and Leaghie Hopewati. So, I mean, I'm quite excited about the Seagulls. For those of you who have watched my ladder prediction video, you'll be able to see that I predict them to finish in the top 4 this year. And I think a big reason why is just the strength 1-17 that they have. So I've got Trontarovic in there at fullback, obviously, household name. The wings, I've gone with Jason Saab and Ruben Garrick. Now, Garrick, it does seem unlikely that he's going to be picked there. They really like him at center, but I think defensively he has his woes in that position. So I'd want to go Garrick, but we'll see which way they go on that. In the centers, I've gone Tolu Kola and Tommy Talau. So Leaghie Hopewadi is the unlucky man to miss out, but that's also partly because I think he's arguably the most versatile of any of them. So when one of those back 5 go down, Tom Trbojevic being included, Leaghie can fill that position, and I think it would cause the least amount of disruption to everyone involved. Moving on to the rest of the team, Brooks and Cherry Evans obviously in the halves. Front row, I've gone with Taniela Paseka and Jake Trbojevic. I'm moving Jake Trbojevic out of the 13 jumper. He already basically plays as a front rower anyway. I think it's good towards the end of his career to simplify his role a little. In the back row, I've got Hamale Olakau'atu and Ben Trbojevic, who we saw improve, I think, a decent amount last year. I think he added a few things to his game, became a lot more of a solid player. Hopefully that will continue throughout this season. And Nathan Brown, wow, he had a really, really strong 2024, which I think very, very few people were expecting. But to see him kick on in 2025 would be a very, very crucial aspect of Manly's charge into the top 4. On the bench, Jazz Tavanga in at 14, very versatile player. Then you've got a little bit of a drop-off in quality, and it has to be said, and this is why I have them at 4th and no higher. Siosiwa Taukiaho, very, very good player in his day. Is his day behind him? Time will tell. Toff Sipley does a job. Ethan Bullymore, a back row who I'm pretty excited to watch every time I see him named. Looking at the side, I mean, the quality and depth in the backs, plus the stable squad, as I mentioned, that's an absolute strength of theirs. The only question is the forward depth, as I mentioned there with the bench, but you know, I think they've signed Matt Lodge to a train and trial contract as well, so he'll come in and provide a little bit of quality there. And all they need is a couple of guys to step up, and they will absolutely back themselves to get the best out of people like Taukiaho, Toff Sipley, and Bullymore. So I'm high on Manly for this year. I think it's sort of primed, looking at the talent that they have in their side, for them to have a very good year. And I mean, when it's been a while since Manly were really contending for premierships. They had a good 2021 season, but I think Rugby League could probably benefit from a title charge for the Sea Eagles. Not to mention that, as I said in the main channel video, guys like Cherry Evans and Jake Trbojevic are at the end of their careers now. Trbojevic probably still has, you know, 2 maybe 3 years left in him, but DCE, there's rumors of him retiring at the end of this year. So this could be it, and their desire to send him out on a high will be absolutely huge. And even for him individually, he's won a premiership before, but it was very, very early on in his career, and failed to do so. I think he made the grand final in 2013 against the Roosters, but it would be a bit of a mark on his legacy if he won one super early and just couldn't do it again after that. So he will be so keen on both a team and a personal level to get it done for Manly. The Cowboys, after finishing 5th last year, will have high expectations for themselves, but recruitment-wise, it's not been anything that special. Their only 2 real major recruits are Carl Lawton and John Bateman into the back row, as well as bringing in Kai O'Donnell and Jackson Paulo, but Bateman and Lawton are the 2 big ones. Neither of those particularly get me very excited, particularly when you think about the fact that they're filling the gaps left by the departure of Kulikepu Finafuiaki and the injury of Hylam Lukey. Pair that with the fact that this side is losing a lot of experience. They're losing the likes of Chad Townsend, Val Holmes, Carl Felt, and Jake Granville, as well as a few squad players like Jermaine Tano-Brown and Jazare Pu'avase. So that's a lot of experience that they're losing. That's a lot of leadership that they're using. In key moments, in crunch moments, that's a lot of guidance that they're losing. They've got guys like Scott Drinkwater, Reece Robson, and Tom Dearden now, who have been together and played together for quite a long time and do have enough experience probably to just about get them through those moments. But I don't think they have the experience to push them further up the table than where they already are. I think the Cowboys will make the 8, but I think it will be a bit of a struggle for them. Looking at their side at fullback, obviously it's Scott Drinkwater. I think he's one of the most underrated players in the entire NRL. On the wings, Murray Taulagi and a rookie from Papua New Guinea, Robert Darby, who is a guy I'm very, very excited about because I love watching the Kummels play, and he's so good for the Kummels. Seeing a guy like him get an opportunity at the NRL level, which hopefully he will, is always so good for the international game. And he's a dynamic player, very, very fast, pretty lanky as well. Reminds me a bit like a young Nenny McDonald, but maybe with a little bit more speed in him. Centers, Zach Leibart and Biliami Vailea. Leibart looked really, really good in the few games he played last season before doing his ACL. And Vailea, lots of promise coming through. Was a guy I really liked in his early days of his career. He did well to nail down a spot last year. Has never really been, the explosive young center that we thought he was going to become. But I'm not ruling out that he could still yet be that, especially with Valentine Holmes going. There's more pressure on him to provide a bit more attacking output. So we could well see that. The halves, Tom Dearden at 5'8", and I have gone with Tom Duffy at halfback. Now, obviously, Jake Granville led them to a 5th place finish Jake Clifford, led them to a 5th place finish last year, although he didn't come in really until the very back end of the season. It's like I mentioned earlier, where I said that my mentality is if you're not going to win a premiership now, you should solely be setting up to win one in the future. And is Jake Clifford ever going to be a premiership winning halfback? I don't see it. So based on that, I'm thinking, why pick him then? Whereas this Tom Duffy is very highly regarded coming through the grades up in Queensland and could well be that guy. Him building a combination with Tom Dearden this season could pay absolute dividends in 2 or 3 years' time and potentially be the difference between them being a very good side and winning a premiership. In the front row, moving on, I've got Griffin Neame and Jason Taumalolo. Taumalolo, it's a tough one to talk about because even obviously the Cowboys don't know exactly how to handle him. But as I mentioned with a few other older front rowers in this video, I think just simplify his role, get him out of the 13 jersey, make him, just absorb the early pressure. His body is a little under question, but at the same time, I don't think with a guy like Taumalolo you can shield him. He's still quite intimidating to come up against, so I go with him in the front row along with young Griffin Neame. Reece Robson in at hooker. Back rows, obviously, Jeremiah Nene picks himself, and John Bateman now filling in for Leaguie, and the lock, the captain of the club, along with Tom Dearden, Reuben Cotter, absolutely synonymous with the Cowboys. What a player he is for them. On the bench, jersey 14, I've gone with Carl Lawton. Obviously, can play hooker and the back row if he needs to. Cohen Hess, who's now pretty much an out-and-out middle. McLean as well, who could be an option to start instead of Taumalolo, have Taumalolo coming off the bench. I don't really mind between those two. And Sam McIntyre, a guy who deserves his flowers after last year. He was really, really solid for the Cowboys. Did well and is actually a lot more versatile than I originally gave him credit for. Is apparently somewhat comfortable even playing in the hooker role. So that might fill in for, Lawton being not maybe the most versatile 14. McIntyre being able to fill a couple more of those spots could prove the difference there. The upside for this side, they're fullback, they're 5'8", they're hooker. Absolutely supreme. All three of those guys, as far as I'm concerned, are Origin level. Robson and Dearden do play Origin, and Scott Drinkwater we constantly see him at the Dally M Awards, how high he finishes. He's a very, very talented player. And if he wasn't coming through at the same time as just this like incredible spate of New South Wales fullbacks of James Tedesco, Dylan Edwards, Tom Trbojevic, like he'd have made his debut at some point. We saw the likes of Matt Moylan and Josh Dugan be New South Wales fullbacks, and I have Drinkwater on that level for sure. But the question is that halfback role. I've said it a number of times in this video. It's the most important position in the team, and you need to have it nailed down. You need to have a plan, and it's quite possible that North Queensland have a solid, clear plan in their minds that they've communicated with their players and they know exactly what they're going to do with that jersey. But from the outside looking in, it looks like it could be Duffy, could be Clifford. I originally thought it might be Jackson Purdue. Like there's just a lot of options, and that instability isn't good, especially when you pair it with the fact that they do lack a little bit of forward depth now, in my opinion, with Leaguie out. If they get an injury to the back row, it's very difficult to see who comes in. Kai O'Donnell, I think, was the one that I eventually landed on, but that's not, a particularly solid backup, NRL level backup player. So it's a bit of a interesting season coming up for the Cowboys. I've seen a lot of people have them firmly in the top 4, but I think I see a little bit of a drop off on the way. Finally in the top 4 now, and thank God, because I'm getting absolutely exhausted. We've got the Cronulla Sharks, and they're signing. I mean, it's clear Adam Fanua-Blake is the guy. He transforms his team completely from a side who is good to a side who should be expecting to take home the premiership, at least internally. They are a top 2 or 3 contender for sure for this year's comp. And the criticism since Greg Fitzgibbon came in as head coach was always that while they have very good backs, their forwards did lack a little bit of size. They had the likes of Oregon Kaufusi, Toby Rudolph. Braden Hamlin-Uele's a big boy, but not an enforcer as such. They lacked an enforcer, and they've gone out and got probably the single best enforcer they could possibly have got in the form of Adam Fanua-Blake. He's absolutely transformational to this side. And yes, they had to let go of the likes of Royce Hunt and Jack Williams in order to do that, but we are talking about a guy who is in a completely different category in terms of quality to those two. And it means that this Sharks side, although it is still quite stable over the last few years, the back 5 pretty much being the same as always. Kennedy, Katoa, Ramian, Iro, and Mulatalo. The halves is where there starts to be a little bit of a change. I do think Nico Hines should be moved to 5'8", in my opinion. I think Trindle is a bit more suited to that halfback role, and it just frees up Hines to be that attacking weapon, the blade of the sword, while Trindle can be the handle. I think that's the way that those two players are best suited to one another. I think Hines has had a tremendous period at halfback for the Sharks, but in the big moments against the big teams, it hasn't been enough to get them over the line. So Hines at 6 and Trindle at 7 for me. In that front row position, you've got that man, Adam Fanua-Blake, as well as Tom Hazelton, who's an absolute try-scoring machine now, cult hero down there in the Shire. Blake Brayley picks himself at hooker, obviously. Britton Nickora and Teague Wilton in the back row, as well as Cam McInnes in at lock. Siosifa Talakai will be my number 14 on the bench. Now, that is assuming that Craig Fitzgibbon goes with his 4-forward bench style that he has done over the course of his coaching career so far at the Sharks. If he does want to go with a traditional number 14, Daniel Atkinson probably fills that role, and in fact has done for the Las Vegas fixtures. Other guys I'd have on the bench, I'd go with Toby Rudolph, Oregon Kaufusi, and Braden Hamlin-Uele. This is just a side that have added their missing piece. There is no excuse now. They've got a strong enough side on paper to do the job. They've got enough experience now in the finals, and the team chemistry that they've got there, it's almost second to none given how long some of these guys have played alongside each other. There are still some question marks. Will Kennedy, for example, at fullback, is he a premiership caliber fullback? But to be honest, I mean, a lot of people cast a lot of doubts about that, but I think, yes, he's not the best fullback, right? Of the teams that are predicted to finish in the top 8, he might be the worst fullback of all those teams. But we've seen teams win, like 2015, for example, Lachlan Coote. He was never a very, very good player. But, well, no, he was a good player. He was never an outstanding player. But he won the premiership with the Cowboys. We've seen it done before. It certainly helps to have a super high standard fullback, but it's not necessary. Charles Nicoll-Klokstad, for example, 2019 grand final. They didn't win, but they were absolutely in that game and could have very easily won. So it's not something that's going to prevent the Sharks from winning the comp. Yeah, they're a side that I'm expecting big things from this year. Moving on to the Roosters. I've never spoken into a camera for this long. I am flaking. Their signings, I mean, relative to their departures, underwhelming. They've got Chad Townsend, obviously originally signed as halfback depth, but will be their starting halfback until Sam Walker returns from his ACL injury, as well as Mark Nwangani-Tuase, who is an exciting player for sure, but is one who could take some time to adjust over from playing rugby union. He's not experienced in league much at all. So while I have high expectations that he will prove to be a very, very good NRL player in the fullness of time, I don't necessarily expect him to be able to provide huge results for now, especially given that he's playing probably centre, in fact almost certainly centre, which is one of the toughest positions defensively to coordinate yourself in. So he's got a bit of a task ahead of him, but a good signing from the Roosters, but as I mentioned, pales in comparison to their losses. Just listen to this list. Joseph Suaalii, Joseph Manu, Jared Waria-Hargreaves, Luke Keary, Sitili Tupouniua, Terrell May, and even Michael Jennings. I mean, Jennings is obviously he was 36 from my memory, but he played 10 games or so for them last season. He played a lot. So is a relatively key loss in his own right. But the quality of some of those other guys, Suaalii, Manu, Tupouniua, May, Keary, they're facing a really tremendous rebuild this year, the Sydney Roosters, and it's about bringing in the next generation, this next year or two for them, and setting up for their next era. And that's sort of what they can do with their 17. I've got James Tedesco in at fullback, obviously, club captain. Tupou did re-sign for one season, so he will line up on the wing, as well as Dominic Young, with Mark Nwangani-Tuase, and in my opinion, it will be young Robert Toya in the centres. I had a bit of concerns over his defensive lapses that he showed in the preseason challenge a little bit, but a very, very talented player if you look at his highlight reels coming through, and he suffered quite significant injuries in recent years as well, so those highlight reels would be even better if he had stayed match fit. He looks like the most exciting young centre to come through the Roosters since the likes of Latrell Mitchell. So that's exciting stuff. Sandon Smith in at 5'8", a guy who has been in and around the NRL for quite a number of years now, but the Roosters have put their faith into him. With rumours linking them to the likes of Dylan Brown, they've constantly shut those down and said Sandon Smith is our guy. So there's got to be something to Sandon. He showed a clean pair of heels in the preseason challenge, so got a bit of toe on him as well. Halfback will be Chad Townsend, but of course, goes without saying, Sam Walker is their best option there. Front row, Nafahu White, I believe, will be the man to pick up the mantle that Jared Waria-Hargreaves has left behind. Collins will be their forward leader, but White will play in that number 8 jersey, with hooker will be Connor Watson, but Brandon Smith will return into that jersey once he's back from injury. In the back row, I've gone with Angus Crichton and Victor Radley and Siwa Wong at lock. Now, I used to really like Radley at lock, being that ball-playing style, but last season at back row, I feel he did okay. And in the trials, the Roosters did seem to prioritise playing Siwa Wong at lock instead. Listening to the Rugby League Guru when Wong was debuting, he said he was better as a lock, so we'll potentially see that a lot this year. Connor Watson being their best number 14 will fill that role once Brandon Smith comes back. Until then, it might be a guy like Tyler Moriarty or Zach Docker-Clay, who I haven't been able to figure out whether he's still signed with the club. I know his contract did expire, but he played the All-Stars match with a Roosters logo on his jersey, which would suggest that he is still signed with them. You've got Spencer Leniu as well, who should be coming off the bench there, and I've gone with the two Butcher brothers, to fill out the rest of that 17. Obviously, if you're searching for positives with the Roosters, they're very exciting rookies. Like, there's still enough quality in these sides to make the finals. And those guys will provide good backups for players if they, obviously, if you're looking for positives with the Roosters, there are very exciting rookies there. You've got, the guys like Toya, guys like Sandon Smith, Blake Steep, who I didn't mention in my 17, or the Va'a brothers. These are guys who, just monitoring NRL rookies coming through, you hear a lot about. So to see so many of them at the Roosters is exciting for Roosters fans. So you've got that. You've got decent backups for Sam Walker and Brandon Smith, particularly with Smith. I mean, having Connor Watson, who's a New South Wales level hooker, come in and play that role is as good as you could possibly ask for. And while a lot of people will, have their opinions on Chad Townsend, being a backup halfback, he is a very good option for them. So it's not the end of the world. And not to mention, through luck of the draw, the Roosters have their buys all quite early, so they'll be playing fewer games without Brandon Smith and Sam Walker until those two return. But realistically, the downsides for this side are pretty easy to pick out. The tremendous departure list, massive leadership void now left. Essentially, if you're looking for leaders in the Roosters team, you've got James Tedesco, Lindsay Collins. That's really, Daniel Tupou, but is not really the leadership type. So you're lacking there quite a bit. You've obviously, despite the fact that they went well last year, they have underachieved massively since going back-to-back in the 2018 and 2019 seasons. And this is probably the weakest side they've had on paper since those years. So it's not a great sign. And Trent Robinson, the pressure's on. The pressure is on him. They do love him internally at the Roosters, and it does seem like he'll be trusted with what is another rebuild. But if a matter of years go by and he's still not able to get this side back genuinely competing for premierships, his job could well be on the line. So this is an important year for him, setting up the next few years of the future for the Roosters, and we'll see how well he can do. Moving on to the Storm, they've obviously signed Stefano Utoikamanu from the West Tigers, who's going to replace the retiring Christian Welch. But aside from that, their squad is very, very stable. Remus Smith left before the end of last season, so not a huge loss. Young Tonamapea was just a squad player, as was Chris Lewis and Tepai Moiroa. They have signed as well Moses Leo from New Zealand Rugby, but he's not a player that I really know very much about at all, and I haven't been able to find all that much about him, to be honest. I've seen a few highlight clips, and he does look quite good, but it's not quite clear to me exactly where he does fit into this Melbourne side, which is so stacked. You'd have Ryan Pappenhausen in at fullback, Xavier Coates and Will Warbrick obviously on the wings, Jack Howarth and Nick Meaney obviously in the centres. Best halves pairing in the comp, Munster and Hughes. Front row, you have Josh King and Stefano Utoikamanu with Harry Grant in at hooker. Back rows, so good. Sean Blaw and Katoa are, I think, the best back row pairing in the premiership, with Trent Loiero in at lock, who is a player that I didn't think had these levels in him. He was in the Origin camp last year, so for him to get up to that kind of level, it's something I think only Craig Bellamy really could do. Tyron Wishart, arguably the best number 14 in the comp, fills up that jersey with Nelson Asafa-Solomona, Tui Kamikamica, and Alec McDonald, the other players on that bench. It's a big, big bench. I wouldn't mind maybe putting another back rower in there in place of Alec McDonald, but there's not a super obvious option. You could go with Joe Chan, I suppose, but we'll see what way Craig Bellamy decides to fill out his team. Honestly, looking for weaknesses in this side, it's very hard to pick any. The spine didn't actually play all that much together last year, so they'll be better for having played a bit more together this year. That could potentially bring complications, but it's very unlikely, and I do think that their chemistry should improve throughout the year, and they've got no losses really significant at all aside from Welch. They are the best side on paper in the premiership, as I mentioned, best halves pairing. Recruitment of Stefano in the one position that you could argue that they potentially lacked quality. Were they one big dominant front rower short of winning the premiership last year, you could make that argument. Penrith won the grand final physically. So getting Stefano in is the perfect remedy to that. And yeah, they're my premiership favourites for a reason, and they're my minor premiership favourites for a reason as well. I think they are almost a perfect side when you look through their 1-17, and that's not something I would say, I think, for any other team in this premiership. And finally, it is those Penrith Panthers, the side that have won 4 premierships in a row, signing Isaiah Papali'i and Blaise Talangi after losing Jerome Luai, Sunia Taruva, James Fisher-Harris, Isaiah Ayongi, and Tyrone Peachey. Now, Isaiah Papali'i is a guy who we've seen tremendous quality from in his time at Parramatta. It did not work out for him at the Tigers, but going into that Penrith system, there's certainly high expectations of him. He's still only quite young, mid-20s. So for him to land in that position, it's as good as he could have wanted a direction for his career to go. And is in some decent real estate now, that is for sure. So he could become a very frustrating player that Tigers fans look back on and go, well, why weren't you performing like that with us, bro? But I back him quite highly. And Blaise Talangi, surprised to see him not named in the 5/8 position for Vegas. I was certain he would be. But I still have no doubt that he's a very good long-term option there for Penrith. Now, in terms of their losses, I mean, we spoke about Luai in depth when we covered the Tigers. I think he's really, really important to this Penrith side, and they will have to fundamentally change the way that they play in order to play without him, but they can do that. You know, they do have the cattle to cope with that loss. Sunia Taruva, replaceable by McLean easily enough. James Fisher-Harris will be harder to replace, but Lindsay Smith is a Kangaroos level front rower now. He's played for Australia, so to have that guy coming in to fill that void is as good as you could possibly have asked for. For their 17, I've got Edwards obviously at fullback, McLean and To'o are on the wings. In the centres, Paul Alamotti and Isaac Tungo. Now, I have gone with Talangi in the 5/8 role, even though I know he has not been named there, but I still think over the course of this season, he will prove to be the option that they go with eventually, with Nathan Cleary, of course, in there at hooker. Then got Moses Leota and Lindsay Smith in the front row. Very solid front row pairing, even without Fisher-Harris, with Mitch Kenny in between them. You got Isaiah Papali'i and Liam Martin. Those are 2 very, very good back rowers on their day. Liam Martin, now a Clive Churchill winner, and Papali'i, we spoke about earlier. So much quality in there, with Isaiah Yeo, one of the greatest locks rugby league has seen ever, in that 13 jersey. That's a very, very good starting 17. And then a bench, you've got Brad Schneider, Liam Henry, Scott Sorensen, and Luke Garner. Those guys can do a job. And while you do lose a little bit of quality by bringing them on, it's not a heap. And, what side has a bench that's as good as their starting team anyway? So that's what I've gone with for the Penrith Panthers. They have that knowledge of how to win. They have that winning mentality. They've climbed the mountain now 4 years in a row. They know exactly how it's done, and they have replaced their departures absolutely brilliantly. It is a big departure haul. It's the biggest one yet, and so I do think it will take a little bit of time to adjust, but they've got the cattle to do it. And God, if we're here in a year's time and they've won 5 in a row, it's not a huge shock. Anyway, there it is. I'm absolutely spent. I've been recording for so long, but I hope you guys did enjoy. This is my first ever go at this, so it will get better, I'm sure, over time. I'm going to be doing long-form things like this, short-form things that are more reactive. They'll be available wherever you get your podcasts. This is a project I'm very excited about. It's going to be delivering a lot of high-quality content, and I'm sure you are all going to love it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.